we were talking about that imaginary. What's interesting in this is that, okay? First of all, you got to understand that there is a gap. And this gap will continue with the infant up until his or her life, according to Lacan. Okay? There is an originary gap here. Okay? At the same time, in this imaginary, actually Lacan calls that image which forms itself in the cognition of the child as imago, that self-image presenting itself in the form of a unity, while the child is far from constituting a real unity, okay? So that's why it's imaginary and fantastic. He calls it as imago, the self-image of the child which does not reflect the reality of the child. Nevertheless, it is necessarily formed during this initial stage, okay, due to the gap between the motor activities or capacities of the child and the cognitive capacities, okay. So the unfortunate situation is this, that the cognitive capacities had been developed up to the point of constituting, allowing the child to constitute unities on the one hand, while the child is far from, in its real existence, is far from forming, assuming a form of unity in its own existence. That's a serious and real gap. That's why that image should necessarily be formed as an imagination, act of imagination, okay? Actually here referring to the act of imagination, referring back to the Kantian faculty of imagination, okay? Finding itself in the very constitution of consciousness. So this act of imagination producing a fantastic, Lacan would call this, actually in French, moi. A certain imaginary conception of the I, if you like, okay? Originating out of the particular history of the child with that significant other. Okay, so one important point is here that even from the very beginning of the constitution of the selfhood, this means that there is no pre-given. Kant was assuming that that selfhood, that consciousness was given to us by nature. Since we are human beings, we have been endowed with these all things, okay? We have been endowed, decorated, empowered, if you like, by a given consciousness, given by nature, and given sensibility, so on and so forth. However, here, there is nothing given. Or if you like, what is given is just a body to which Lacan would refer as the real, okay? Which is not capable of constituting itself a body. Body implying, you know, a form of unity. A body, but this is a body far from having a unity, if you like, okay? So it is in its terms a contradiction itself. A body which is not in the form of unity, the Gestalt he is talking about, a certain form, okay? And so the real remains untouchable, and the relationship with the imaginary and the real, as you can see, the imaginary has nothing to do with the real of the body of the infant here, okay? But it is all, everything to do with the reflection from the mirror, okay? It's therefore the particular product, in other words, the first form of selfhood, in this narcissistic form, the first form of selfhood, okay, originates out of the primal social relationship of the child with that significant other social environment, taking place in its social environment. Okay? And yet still this relationship, what this relationship, this social relationship produces at this moment of the development of the child has nothing to do with the real. Therefore, it turns out to be imaginary, fantastic. Now, it has certain importance in its own self. First of all, because it for the first time gives the child an opportunity to establish an identification. Okay? So, according to Lacan, while at the same time, however, it promises the possibility of a unity in the form of a definite identification, okay, through the other, through the immediacy of the other, if you like. On the other hand, it at the same time destroys any possibility for the child to establish a complete identity. Why? Simply because it has nothing to do with the real, okay? So the child, and since this imago of the child would remain with the child throughout all his or her life, okay, it means practically that the child would turn out to be subject to the oscillations between this imago and what may be termed as real, and later on I'm going to introduce what Lacan calls the symbolic. Okay? So, in these oscillations, the child, if you like, would suffer from this lack of unity, from this lack of completeness. And all the tensions between this imago and especially this symbolic, okay, will show and emphasize this indispensable character of the imago on the one hand, but its potential to create problems on the other. Okay? So actually, as you can see, all depends from the very beginning, according to Lacan, a certain lack. Actually, the lack here is nothing else than that lack of unity in the real. Okay. This term lack would be an important term for Lacanian psychoanalysis, simply because, as you'll see later on, Lacan would connect this concept of lack with a very important conceptualization later on began to dominate the scenery, desire. Now, desire, as you'll see later on, had been introduced into the discussion as the replacement, if you like, as the replacement of that good old and worn out concept of the, later on, will. Now, the idea of will, as we have discussed earlier, connects itself with the idea of volition, and therefore it necessarily derives from the notion of the freedom of the acting. Let me call here it as subject in this context, subject, but in quotation marks. Now, we have seen that will necessarily comes out of a certain conceptualization of the subject, which attributes the subjecthood the quality of freedom. Okay? Now, however, its replacement, if you like, postmodern or prior to postmodern, post-structuralist, and later on postmodern replacement desire would completely refer to something else. Okay? It would directly, at least within the confines of, we will see another alternative to this view, at least within the context of the Lacanian analysis, it directly refers to that originary lack. It is out of this originary lack the imaginary comes into the picture, okay? And however, when it comes to into the picture, it on the one hand offers the infant with a possibility of identification in the form of a totality, but on the other hand, it would destroying it at the same time. Okay? Now, that was a very beautiful quotation in that regard. If I can find, let me see. Okay, I guess it's this. The mirror stage is a drama, Lacan writes, okay, whose internal thrust is precipitated from insufficiency to anticipation, and which manufactures for the subject, caught up in the lure of spatial identification, the succession of fantasies that extends from a fragmented body image to a form of its totality that I shall call orthopedic. And lastly, to the assumption of the armor of an alienating identity, assumption of an armor of an alienating identity. So, the identity acquired here in this mirror stage, yes, it's an identity, a form of identity, but since it's imaginary, fantastic, it's at the same time an alienating identity, okay? Which will mark with its rigid structure the subject's entire mental development, okay? Or else, another beautiful quotation in that regard, the mirror image is a mirage of the eye and promises that the individual's latent powers of coordination will eventually be realized. Indeed, it has a role in triggering the development of these. So, that the infant's body acquires a certain form of unity owes very much to the development of this imago on the first place, okay? So, the child's conception of its own self in the form of a unity having an impact in the organization of child's body as a unit, okay? Or if you like, his or her development of motor capacities, okay? Indeed, it has a role in triggering the development of this. So far, so good. But the alienating destination of the I is such that the individual is permanently in discord with himself. So that's why we are talking about alienation. Actually, since this imago is imaginary, this practically means that whatever the individual does in his or her life, it can never match or satisfy the demand of that imaginary imago. Okay? It can never overlap, or its actual existence, I'm going to explain what I mean here in this context by actual, its actual existence can never constitute a complete match with the originally formed imago. Okay? This means that the individual will forever remain, while he or she is alive, dissatisfied with his or herself. Okay? The I is tirelessly intent upon freezing a subjective process that cannot be frozen, introducing stagnation into the mobile field of human desire, Lacan says. Okay? So then the imaginary constituting a promise on the one hand for identification for the child, but on the other hand, this is an alienating identification simply because the child would never be able to realize it while he lives or she lives. Okay. Now, actually, it is in this context, okay, we place in Lacanian thinking the child within the scenery of the Oedipus complex. Okay? Now, Oedipus complex means here that the child who at the stage of mirror image was not aware of the existence of the overwhelming power of the social networks into which he or she is born, okay, now gradually comes to recognize the existence of that social network. Through what? As the Oedipus complex discusses already, through the power of the intervention of the father. Okay? So father intervenes into this seemingly happily ongoing relationship, intimate and affectionate relationship between the child and the mother, and brings about the rules of the external world. Okay? The rules of the external world, powerful enough to determine from then on how that relationship between the child and that the significant other, usually the mother, will continue, go on. Okay? Now there are certain possibilities, and the first reaction, as it has been discussed, the first reaction of the child, especially during the mirror stage, when this identification turns out to be completing itself, the identification with the mother on the part of the child, and later on identification with that component which is primarily lacking in the mother. Now this feeling of lack, what lacks in the mother, can only enter into the picture, of course, as you can imagine, through the intervention of the father. If there was no father, there wouldn't be any idea of any lack here. Okay. So what the mother lacks in front of the father is exactly the thing the child turns out to identify itself, and therefore through this identification, in his identification with the mother, completes the mother with what she lacks. Okay? The phallus, if you like. Okay? But the intervention of the father, forcing the mother and the child to reorganize their happily going relationship, disturbing this gives the child the possibility of either remaining identified with the mother or turn his focus of identification or her focus of identification with the father. Okay. Now, as you can see, there may be many problems in the ongoing stages of this process, okay? Many problems, but if everything goes normal, a boy child ends up identifying with his father and therefore maintaining that one of the original identifications with phallus, and tends to replace father in his adult life. And the reverse happens as things goes normal or expected for the girl child, ending up with the second best, substituting the original best, seeing the female child not supply the mother with what she lacks, okay, turning to identify herself with the second best, the mother, and so on, okay. That's not important. What is important here is that power of intervention by the father, representing phallus. So you should understand phallus here in this context not as a specific human body part, but rather the expression of what Lacan would call the symbolic. Simply because the intervention by the father is exactly the moment of introduction of the external social into that originary intimate relationship between the mother and the child. Okay? Now, it's no longer the significant other which determines and regulates the relationship, but something else. In the name of the father, actually, that which is operating here in this regulation is nothing else than what Lacan would call the social bond. The social bond expressing itself in the form of the symbolic, if you like, language. You know, it was structuralism's tenet to identify language as the very social bond itself. Okay? So, through the language acquisition, actually this is a very critical moment. The human child turns out to be a human, departing the nature behind and enters into the world of culture, if you like. Okay? You know, that debate about leaving behind nature and entering into culture, world of culture, turns out to be one of the important themes of structuralist and later on post-structuralist thinking. Even though when we proceed into the depths of post-structuralism, you are going to see that such a difference would disappear. But at the initial stage, especially when the impact and effects of structuralism can still be felt strongly, this turns out to be an important point in argumentation. Okay, leaving behind the nature and entering into the world of the social or culture. Okay? So it is through this intervention of the father, the child for the first time comes face to face with the power of the symbolic. This is the stage of child's acquisition of language. Okay? It's through language the child comes to learn what it means to say I in the symbolic. He or she acquires a name and comes to learn how this name turns out to be related with the other terms. I'm talking about the signifying chain here, as you can see, with the other terms in this kinship relations, web of kinship relations of that Oedipus triangle. Okay? Mother, father, and the child. It appears that, you know, remember the basic premises of structuralism. There is no mother in itself. There is no father in itself. And of course, there is no child in itself. Okay? So the value of each of these three terms is determined and can only be assessed only through relating them with the other terms. What we are talking about in this stage of language acquisition or entering into the world of the symbolic is exactly learning these relative relations of the terms, nothing else. Learning what a child is in this family triangle of father, mother, and child. Okay? In other words, learning what your name means in these relationships of kinship. Okay? Otherwise, there is, as I said, no mother in itself, no father in itself. Only and only when these are related with each other, you'll get what mother is, what father is, and what a child is. Now we are talking about child's learning of what these terms means. Okay, this is nothing else than the learning of the language. Okay? And through learning of the language, as you can see, the child comes to recognize and acknowledge the power of the external social world. Knowing the value of the father, for instance, here in this chamber. Okay? Shh, shh. Your father will get angry. When he comes back home, I'm going to tell your father about what you have done, for instance. Okay? Or the particular relationship with the mother. Okay? The child learns them through this language acquisition, and in Lacanian terminology, enters into the order of the symbolic. Now, the first stage was imaginary, producing a fantastic imago, a self-image of the child which does not correspond with the reality on the one hand, and on the other hand, would not be able to cope with what the child is determined in the symbolic. Now, the first one was fantastic and completely dependent upon that personal history of the child's relationship with the mirror, whoever it was. Okay. On the other hand, the second one, however, is not something personal. Okay. It is about the distribution of the social roles in a given social setting, and compulsory, so to speak, learning of the child about these social roles. Now, the problem, as you can see here, is the question of how this imago, fantastic imago, will cope with this symbolic individual there, okay, with a proper name. Okay. Now, this formation of the symbolic or entering into the symbolic is what exactly enabling the child to refer to itself in the form of an I. You know, that subject of the sentence. I am thinking this. I don't want to eat. I see you. I am willing to come to this place, etc. I am talking about this grammatical I as the sentence, subject of the sentence, subject of the symbolic. Lacan would express this as the je. And if moi, we are going to translate moi as me. Here, what the child finds him or herself in is the position of the je, with the, as a result of entrance into the symbolic. Okay? Or if you like, translate into English, I. Okay? Do you have any questions up to this point? No questions at all. We have all learned that language very well. And having no problems at all. Fine, very good. But for Lacan, actually this is not the end of our problems, but on the contrary, perhaps the very beginning of our problems, simply because there are several difficulties here. If I would turn out to be an individual having no social connections at all, but having still once upon a time when in my childhood, infancy, a mother, it means practically that I would have my imago well developed. And if I do not confront this society in my later life, the symbolic in other words, I would not have any problems, okay? I would be free to imagine myself in any way I like to be, okay? Actually, not I like to be, simply because it has, according to Lacan, had already been determined in my childhood. Whatever, okay? What's the problem there? It has been determined. I would feel myself confined with what I think I am. What I think fantastically I am. There would no problem at all, okay? But I had entered into the network of social relations through the letter of the father. We are going to talk about this article later on. Through the letter of the name of the father, I've been introduced into the language which reflects the social bond, or if not only the social bond, the power, undeniable power of this social bond, okay? And now, that socially produced je, I, what I am expected to be, in other words, in the symbolic order, in my social existence, if you like, and what I feel myself am, can well easily come into contradiction. Okay? And for Lacan, the actual individual, the real subject which he represents, to be able to show actually that it is not complete and constituted of lack in this form, as striked out as, okay, actually is exactly what oscillates between this moi of the imaginary and the je of the symbolic order. Okay? The society expects me to be in this or that way, and I am inclined to represent myself or inclined to think about myself in that or that way, and therefore I am always oscillating between these two in my whole life, never being able to find a satisfactory point of reconciliation between these two demands. Remember, in Freudian tale, this has been produced as the difficult role. This has been told as the difficult role played by trying to serve two masters. Okay? The superego on the one hand, and what it was, what he called the id. But what was far from being satisfactory for Lacan here is the recourse in Freudian theory to something mystically conceived as biological. The very notion of the id, okay? A hidden, a hiding place for all those dark, mysterious forces of our animal character. Now, the difficulty was this. Let me try to, I'm not sure, try to illustrate you the difficulty. Actually, from the very beginning, I'm saying that from the very early ancient Greek period on, what has been thought as the human, as I told you in our first lecture, was conceived as something, a unity divided into two. There were two major divisions, you gotta remember. First of all, a human being presented in the form of unity. Therefore, unity, actually very function of the unity perhaps, while it internalizes, at the same time it externalizes. So it's this very function of the original unity is to establish that qualitative difference between the internal and external. Okay, I and you. I am internal to myself and you are external to me. Okay, so the world external to me, I am internal to myself. My thoughts, my feelings, whatever I am is internal to me, even my body being external. This requires another division. A division in my totality, okay? My innermost self and my appearance self. Okay, the very first component of my outermost self, so to speak, being my body. Okay? While my innermost self turning out to be expressed in the conception of a certain soul. Later on, we have seen how these concepts acquire new meanings with new terminologies, consciousness, etc., mind, etc. Okay? But these two divisions had been introduced from the very beginning and stays with us up until now. Okay? Now, the Lacanian analysis actually showing us or proposing us to explain away the origin and constitution of these differences. Rather than accepting these differences as given, now this time, Lacan engaged in explaining how these differences came about and what is their relative meaning to each other. Okay? Or if you like, relative value to each other. Now, the difficulty is this. As you can see, here is the innermost, and there is the outermost. And when we go deeper and deeper into the innermost, we came to learn that actually we are not going to find anything. Actually, what we are dealing with is nothing else than what Lacan calls as the real, a term actually having no other function than expressing that we have lost any criteria at all to be able to give us a hint to know about something. Okay? We don't have anything. So in the real, we don't have no knowledge at all. In the real, we do not know what we are. In the real, we simply are. Okay? But the being simply are does not necessarily involve knowing what we are. Okay? That's the exactly problem. Okay? So this division, it comes prior to these divisions. And when we introduce into the picture these divisions, it means that we have already lost sight of the real. Therefore, for Lacan, the real, he talks about three registers or three orders, and the real was one of them, okay? The imaginary, the symbolic, and the real. We are going to come upon a similar concept under a very different guise later on, okay? So the real cannot be known. It's practically simple. Why? Simply because it can neither find this expression in the imaginary, which is fantastic, or in the symbolic, okay? It cannot be expressed. It is exactly that cannot be understood and cannot be expressed, okay? So always avoiding expression and understanding. Therefore, it is out of reach. Remember the Kantian notion of the noumena. Okay? It's exactly out of our reach. Okay? Completely out of our reach. So, and actually when we have already introduced these divisions, it means that we have lost sight of it already. Okay? Fine, all right. And from the very beginning. So let's take a look at in this picture, on this picture, what is actually going on here. Okay, we can approach to this question, to this picture from certain perspectives. From the perspective of knowing, which is one of the backbones of this course, okay, from the perspective of knowing, which in the history of Western thinking called the first philosophy. Okay. Which primarily concerns with the question of cognition. It's also called metaphysics and also called ontology. Ontology meaning what is. And as you can see, this is, so to be able to raise the question of ontology and existence, one has to use that is, okay? Without that is, one cannot talk about the existence as it is ontological status of being. So this means that in this analysis, language already enters into the discussion in a rather fundamental way, okay? This means that without language, whatever that language is, it should not necessarily be the language of tongue. It may be the language of the complex web of relations. Okay? So whatever it is, a language has already been involved in this expression of the question of, as Heidegger put it, the question of being. Okay? So the question of being from the very beginning, if you like, presents itself as a problem of knowing. Okay? Now, my soul conceived to be that knowing part. My mind, my consciousness conceived to be that knowing part. My body conceived to be my animal part. Okay? Now the relationship between my knowing part and my living part turns out to be quite problematic, simply because while my knowing part turns out to be rational or capable of being rational, at least, okay, my body part resists against this. Okay? And this characteristic is called the animosity or the animal character of the body. Okay? For instance, while I'm talking about my soul, I'm talking about the rational questions of knowing, being, etc., etc. When I direct my gaze on my body, what I do come across is unanswerable existence, unexplainable way of existence of passions, desires, drives. So body from the very beginning, being severed from the question of knowing the world, from the very beginning presented as the locus of all those dark forces having an effect on human existence. Okay? Those dark forces capable of taking the soul from its usually expected path as well, rationality. Okay? So, for instance, all the causes of sin, all the causes of crimes, okay, had all been attributed to body. Okay? A body emanating a certain force with which the soul confronts with the problem of controlling them. Okay? Controlling them, putting them under its control. Okay? The body is something slavish, and the soul should reign over it, should control it. Soul is the place of light, while the body turns out to be the place of dark forces, unknowable to the knowledge of the soul. Okay? Now, this actually is the original scenario, actually following us even up today. And now, as you can see, our biological existence had been pointed out as the very source of those dark, uncontrollable, mystical and unknowable, therefore mystical forces. Okay? And Freudian model was in accord with this, as you can see. Okay? Now, out of human unfortunate unity of the body and soul, if this is the human body and soul, okay, finding itself in the larger existence, the problem of knowledge then is something coming out of the soul, taking the immediacy of the external world and returning back into the soul. Okay? Now, however, as the body constituting a part of the external world, and as the world of nature, so-called world of nature, being similar to the body, turn out to be the locus of these mysterious forces. And the task then is to know. That's why scientists claim that what's important for most of us, for us most, is to know the nature. And to be able to know the nature, we need to develop general, universally applicable laws. And through the discovery of these laws, we come to appreciate the dynamics of the forces, dark forces operating in nature. Okay? So, the task of knowledge then turns out to be coming out of itself, go outside of to the locus of those dark forces through the immediacy of your body and return back to the soul again. Okay? Now, however, the problem of knowledge remains forever as an unsatisfied desire on the part of the knowing human. Simply because even in our best hopes, we can only wish to approximate to an understanding of the operation of those dark forces rather than really understanding them. Okay? However, Lacanian analysis makes an important shift here. Okay? This is no longer going outside. Knowing is no longer going outside of the soul and dealing with these mysterious forces and returning back to the soul. Okay? It is rather going out from the imaginary to the symbolic, and trying to establish a reconciliation, a transitory, not so powerful a balance between this moi, fantastic moi, and this symbolic je. Okay? The whole problem of knowledge and the whole problem of actually thinking has been reformulated here. Just like structuralism had eliminated the question of the relationship between the sign and its reference. You know? Here in our example, the nature that we go out, getting out from our souls, okay, turning out to be the referent here, the actual things over there. you know, structuralism by establishing within the structure of sign between a relationship between signifier and signified, therefore eliminating any possibility of referring back to the referent. Here meaning the actual thing that we associate in our usage of language with the sign. The desk. The desk is a sign. But I think that the desk refers to this. Rather, declaring the autonomy of language from the real, okay, therefore cancelling out any possibility of establishing a relationship, at least through the mediacy of language, okay, the whole problem then turns out to be something of this, okay? Rather than going out, all going out actually being delimited by the symbolic. All out turns out to be the symbolic and language, which is independent from the nature. So nature, what you call nature in that case, what you call society in that case, turns out to be nothing else than a language. Okay? And you had been introduced not into the real in this relationship, but to the language. And what you call up until now as the dark forces of nature are nothing else than those forces, values of the signs, if you like, generated in the structure of a language. But there's a problem here. That structure being far from complete. Okay? It means that the value of the signs in that structure is always shifting, changing, about which we are going to talk later. Stay with us.